Okay, this is the house of a young woman called Kate Woolwork, and she's really interesting. Okay, she's by the time the First World War breaks out, she's about 21 or 22. But before that, she's been the secretary of the Women's Social and Political Union, which is the suffragette group in Manchester. And she's been accused in 1913 of blowing up a train in Newton Heath. And this is the thing that William Whittaker stood up and gave a testimonial for her so that she wouldn't be sent to prison. The person that she was accused of blowing up the train with was a woman called Jenny Baines. Jenny Baines was a really well-known suffragette who was doing lots and lots of activism at that time. And Jenny Baines was on the run at that time under something called the Cat and Mouse Act. And this meant that if you committed a crime and you were imprisoned as a suffragette and you were refusing food, and perhaps they were force feeding you and you were very ill, they didn't want you to die because then you would have become a martyr. So they let you out, and then when you got better, they re-arrested you. And this was called the Cat and Mouse Act, and not by the government, by the people, yeah. And obviously what happened is when people were released, they tried very hard to evade being re-arrested. You had a kind of series of houses where people would stay, ways in which people would avoid the police. So this is Kate Woolwork. She's a teacher of shorthand and typing. She's a trade unionist. I think she's a really interesting character. We don't know very much about her. Most of the suffragettes under Mrs. Pankhurst were pro-war because they thought that this was a way in which men would take them seriously and give them the vote. But Kate Woolwork decided that she was against the war. Her younger brother Harry was called up, and I don't know whether that was a way in which she responded to that. But she joined the No Conscription Fellowship with another young woman that used to work at the Clarion Cafe in the middle of town, another trade union woman called Mary Quayle. And they left here and they went to live in a house in Hyde where there was a very active No Conscription Fellowship branch. Now, I don't know, I'd like to think that these young women ran away together and were deeply in love, but I have no way of knowing that. But it's a nice story, all right. So that's my kind of take on that's my kind of take on Kate and Mary. And they kept moving around, and then really I haven't been able to find out very more about her once the war finishes. Opposite Christie's Hospital is a road called Kinnaid Road, and number 6 and number 8 were inhabited by two people who were anti-war. One is Alan Knott. He's a young man at this time. I found out about him completely by chance. He's a Congregationalist, which means he's a nonconformist, and he's a pacifist. And he's a young man, and he is a founder member of this radical organisation called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and he was also part of the No Conscription Fellowship. He's the neighbour of Margaret Ashton. She will have known his parents, she will have known that he'd gone off to college to become a congregational minister. Do you know, they're these kind of links that we can only imagine, but there they are, all right? So Margaret Ashton, it's my life's work now to make her as well known in Manchester as Emmeline Pankhurst, all right? Margaret Ashton is an amazing woman. She's the first councillor in Manchester. She looks after women's issues. She's set up a hostel for women who are homeless. And she says, I don't want to know what they were doing with themselves, I just want to provide a bed for them. So she's not the kind of person that was following some of those Victorian things about we want to know what you've been up to before we give you a bed. She was
it's
very...
like the gym and we want to know personal details for her electronic system.
So she's trying really hard, I think, to be very open-minded. She sets up a babies' hospital because at the time there was a lot of babies dying in Manchester because it's a very poor city. You know, there's a lot of pollution. A lot of people didn't have enough food, and she's very involved in all those kind of things. When the war starts, she leaves the suffrage group which she's been involved with because they were pro-war, and she's involved in setting up the Women's International League. Gradually, she's expelled from the council. They push her out of the council because she's a pacifist. And some of you will know that they made a portrait of her when she was 70, and the council refused to hang this portrait because she had been a pacifist and anti-war. And we found the portrait a few years ago, and we've now got it hung in the city hall. So you can go and look in the town hall, and there she is. And I admire her because she never gave up. Right? She's one of us. She never gave up, and she's quite an old lady by this time. And you see in the papers of the time that she's travelling all over the country to speak on platforms against the war. You know, so she's a kind of. Whereas Emmeline Pankhurst is pro-war, handing out feathers to men that refuse to fight. So we have to champion Margaret Ashton. All right, and this is the home of 4 sisters: Lucy, Emily, Mary and Edith. And they lived here. They didn't have to work. I think their father had owned some kind of mill in Rochdale, and they had their own money, so they didn't have to work. The elder 2, Lucy and Emily, were both involved in the suffrage campaign as suffragists, so they weren't militant suffragettes. But Emily was also involved in trade union campaigns, so she worked alongside Mary Quayle and Kate Walwork. And when the war came, the sisters took opposing views. So Lucy stayed on in the Suffrage Society, which was pro-war, supporting the war, and Emily left, and she was involved in setting up the Women's International League with Margaret Ashton and other people in Manchester. She also became very active in the No Conscription Fellowship, and she edited their little magazine, which I found some copies of. They had a magazine to sort of support each other, give news about what was happening with conscientious objectors. And in the 1901 census, she had described herself as a writer. So whether she had those kind of ambitions to be a bit of a writer. She was also part of anti-vivisection group, and I guess that she might very well have been a vegetarian. I don't know if they had vegans then, I don't know. But she's altogether one of those people that seems to be campaigning. She's born in 1859, so by the time war breaks out, she's into her 50s as well. So she's an older woman who's campaigning. So I rather like these older women who were out there, you know, fighting. And you see her more and more during the war on platforms talking out against the war, travelling across the country and speaking out. And she was part of a big campaign in Manchester that happened in 1970, which was called the Women's Peace Crusade, where they ran a big campaign and they were sort of getting working class women to come out and support them. They had a big meeting in Stevenson Square. Emily Cox was one of the speakers there. So that's her.